As a blazing sun beats down, extreme heat is becoming the norm in the Gulf region. On the first day of summer, temperatures hit 50 degrees Celsius in many places, including Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And that's a major concern for the millions of migrant laborers who toil outdoors. The region relies on workers from Southeast Asia who provide cheap labor and fill jobs at construction sites, in the hospitality sector, or other service industries. But working in such high heat increases risks of dehydration, heat stroke, and heart failure. While Gulf countries have banned working outside during the hottest part of the day, from noon till 4 p.m., many human rights groups say that's done little to prevent heat-related deaths. A recent study by Vital Signs Partnership says that as many as 10,000 migrant workers from South and Southeast Asia die in the Gulf every year, and that more than 1 out of every 2 deaths is effectively unexplained. In reviewing the data, the report said that more than half the cases were recorded with no underlying cause of death, instead simply mentioning cardiac arrest, which only means the heart stopped beating. Thresiyama Joseph says she believes if working conditions were better, her husband would still be alive.
Isaac was under a lot of stress, and he was keeping all of this to himself. If these things had happened on time and he had come back, this wouldn't have happened. That's what I think.
Despite widespread criticism of migrant working conditions, notably in preparations for the World Cup in Qatar, the Gulf states have done little to enact structural labor reforms.
So, as you've seen from this video, it's clear that migrant workers face a harsh reality within Persian Gulf countries, which in the case of Thresiyama cost her husband's life. However, her experience is not unique and is representative of a much larger theme within the region. In my research, I found that the rise in oil wealth and rapid industrialization within Persian Gulf countries acts as a catalyst for the systemic exploitation of migrant workers within the region. In my paper, I will argue that this systemic exploitation is shaped by a combination of institutional, social, and political influences. But for the purpose of time today, I will be focusing on only one example from each. In terms of institutional influences, the kafala system remains a key hurdle for migrant workers in their fight for fair contracts and safe working conditions. Under the kafala system, individual companies or recruiting agencies assume full economic and legal responsibility for migrant workers during the duration of their contract. From recruitment to release, governments essentially turn a blind eye, creating a gap between international law and its domestic applications. And with nobody to hold them accountable, these agencies exploit their workers to no end. This system also limits cohesion between migrant sending countries and migrant receiving countries due to the lack of enforced regulation on contracting. In many cases, this creates a situation where migrants sign a contract in their home country that outline a set salary, set rest days, and appropriate living conditions, but upon arrival to their host countries are forced into signing a new contract contradictory of almost all that was promised, which housed them and forced them to work in conditions similar to those that we just saw in the news clip from Dubai. So I'm sure for some people a natural follow-up question is, why don't they just leave? And the answer is that they can't. The amount of power the kafala system gives to recruitment agencies allows them to confiscate cell phones, passports, and legal documents upon arrival with no repercussions. So shifting gears a little bit, it's clear that with the rise of oil wealth came rapid industrialization in many Gulf countries, but as cities modernized, they also became more expensive. This creates a geographical hierarchy within industrializing cities where high-income nationals enjoy the center of cities and low-income migrants are pushed into the peripherals. In turn, this leads to high levels of social isolation, as peripheral areas such as those seen here surrounding Dubai are not served by public transportation. This makes it nearly impossible for migrants to interact with the rest of the society, therefore reinforcing harmful second-class citizen narratives. In terms of the political, the influences of nationalism and globalization are super interesting in this context because they're part of what inadvertently created the kafala system in the first place, and are also what worked to uphold it in its current state. The Gulf states' push towards globalizing their economies is what first demanded such high volumes of labor, but in decades following, migrant workers began to outnumber nationals in many countries, sparking nationalist concerns about political influence that would later go on to shape the experience of migrant workers. A good example of this is reflected in Kuwait. For context, what I'm showing you here is a graph based on World Bank data that reflects the percentage of migrants in Kuwait relative to the country's total population. As you can see, in 2024, migrants made up 67.3% of Kuwait's total population. As the migrant population began to grow, Kuwaiti populations became increasingly concerned that a large foreign population would disenfranchise them and shift political power to exterior influences. So they introduced a series of labor nationalization policies coined as Kuwaitization, all of which focused on replacing migrant workers with Kuwaiti nationals and establishing a clear distinction between nationals and non-nationals. This created a narrative that migrant workers were a political and social threat to Kuwaiti identity, which opened the door for this constructed threat to then be used as justification for the exclusion and isolation that defines the experiences of Gulf country migrant workers throughout the region at large.